Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Dave.
It's almost noon time, so we better get rolling here because I got a good question. Last week we covered wind shadows going upwind, which it's all visually it's all pretty makes sense, and the downwind can be trickier, right? When you got asymmetrics and symmetric spinnakers and wind shadows are doing different things. So explain to me wind shadows downwind. I know we're probably going to go pretty deep here, and when do I know I'm in dirty air? What do I do about it?
Yeah, I think those are just great questions. I think there's two different modes downwind, and you're kind of moving with the wind, so it behaves very differently than upwind. The two different modes are this more of a drag mode. So suppose you're going straight downwind and you got a symmetric spinnaker, or maybe you're in your laser or something, and S turns aside and riding waves and everything. The wind shadow is basically, suppose you have a spinnaker here. I'll draw that out, and and you're just in this symmetric mode. The wind shadow is basically this vacuum in front of the boat. There's just kind of this no air, and it's not really like flowing by the sails like it does upwind, and what it'll do on the asymmetric, which I'll show you in a minute. So the wind is coming from behind you, and it kind of spills over the spinnaker this way, kind of spills over the main this way. There's some downward motion along the spinnaker coming out the bottom, but the bottom line is there's not much there. I can show you that quickly on we did an article on spinnaker trim, and we did asymmetric and symmetric, so I can show you quickly what that kind of looks like from the side. You see that, Dave?
Yep, I see it.
So from the side, you just kind of see this, those are smoke lines made from a wind tunnel. And we did that at Charlie Williamson's lab at Cornell. We did that for the article. It was kind of fun. And, it's just vacuum behind the sail, right? There's not even a lot of turbulence because there's just nothing, it's just kind of blocking the wind. So then we go to either it's reach mode, whether it's an asymmetric or if you have a symmetric spinnaker and maybe in lighter air, you want to take angles, you're in a different mode. You're letting flow over the sail. So let's look at an asymmetrical spinnaker, and I'll move it over here so you can kind of see. But, suppose you got the spread and you got this, you trimmed in pretty tight in the main, you got the asymmetricals out like that. And this looks a little bit more like it looks upwind. So the apparent wind's from here, say, and the wind is flowing over the sails. There's actually flow over the main, and you kind of got this tail of turbulence and vacuum and, less wind and, just all those vortices and everything. And, you don't, in theory, that's not where you want to be, right? You don't want your air to be in that air. And so that's where you are. So let's look at the wind shadow from that. It's a little harder to get your hands around, your eyes around on this, but this is a wind tunnel, also different view, looking actually straight up. Here's the asymmetrical spinnaker, here's the main, and you're looking straight up from the bottom, like a view you can't have, right?
So essentially from underneath the foot of the spinnaker.
Right, and you can see there's a bit of a vacuum like in the drag mode. There isn't as good flow as upwind, but there's still basic flow around the main, a lot of flow over the spinnaker side to side, edge to edge. And you don't have that on the run mode. So there's more of this tail, but you can see like directly to leeward of it is there's plenty of wind, right? There's wind all around it. It's just this trail behind it, kind of like I drew on the board here.
So real quick before you go back to that, that flow off the leech.
Yeah.
Is that an accelerated flow? Is that a good
place
to be?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the spinnaker, a lot of what the spinnaker is doing. It's just more sail area, but it's also making your main more efficient. And an asymmetric spinnaker, you have to trim that main way in. I've trimmed the boom almost to center line on an asymmetric spin when you're going really fast. Because the apparent wind so far forward, and it's not only is the apparent wind here so far forward, but it gets redirected. Look at the angle difference coming out behind the spinnaker. It really redirects the wind way more than it does with the jib. But yeah, it's doing a lot of the same things that a jib does. Really good flow. You'll see this in any, if you put telltales on your spinnaker on a reach, you'll see good flow over the front side, and the back side, you just can't keep the flow attached all the way.
Great looking stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so explaining a little bit, that known about positioning, and either just defending or just trying to get around past boats in both setups, both in the kind of the what you call it, the drag mode and the reach mode. Yeah.
Yeah. So keeping this in mind, in the really big picture, you don't want to be, say, here, right? Like you're in this dirt, right? But there's a really interesting effect is that you're basically sailing in your wind, not theirs. So your apparent wind tells you where that wind is coming from. So if I were to put a masthead fly in this boat in purple, say, as long as my masthead fly, suppose I'm here, is not pointing at this boat, I'm in good shape. So if my masthead fly is trailing off this way, that means my apparent wind is this way and I'm not in dirt. If I were to say jibe and maybe head up a little bit, my masthead fly would, so the true wind's straight down, right? In this picture, but my apparent wind is different. So if I jibe and I head up just a little bit, even in drag mode, my apparent wind doesn't line up because my motion's going that way. My velocity has something to do with the wind direction. It actually shifts it aft a little bit. And all of a sudden, my apparent wind's here. My masthead flies there. Now it's pointing at that boat. So even though I'm not directly below them, my apparent wind's pointing at them. I'm going to get in that dirty air.
There's sometimes discussion of which masthead fly you look at, your own or the boat behind you. Which one's more?
So this is your masthead fly. You care about your wind, what your wind is on. Match racers will tell you that, they almost don't like to have a masthead fly if they had a choice, because they don't want to know, they don't want the competitor to know where their wind is. So you're trying to figure out where their wind's coming from.
So that's the key. When you're the trailing boat or the attacking boat, you're using the other boats. Yep.
Right. Yeah. Like if I, if I change my apparent wind here, let's suppose this guy's clear, masthead fly straight down, and he's just barely clear, right? So my apparent wind is dead down in this case, right? Right here, it's not pointing at him, it's fine. If this boat jibed, right, jibed the spinnaker and everything, and shifted their own apparent wind to here, headed up a little bit, this boat is still clear. So instead, they have to jibe the other way and try to get between them and the true wind.
So how if from that boat ahead, sometimes it's there's we're all guilty of sort of falling asleep at the wheel. I mean, how do you really know when you're starting to feel the effects? And what do you do about it?
I think that if you have a spinnaker, the trimmer will feel less pressure. Like in this case, if you're in this vacuum, there is a lot less wind. If you're here and you're both, your masthead flies going straight down, your apparent wind's here, and you're in this vacuum, it's pretty bad. Like you'll feel it. You'll feel it on your neck, the apparent wind on your face, the less breeze on the sheets. The trimmer will say, oh, my sheet's super light, and all that kind of good stuff.
And so the quick move is to change your apparent, basically, figure it out one way or the other.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily to head up or down. There's a choice you're going to make. Suppose you find yourself here. Suppose you're sailing along and this guy decides to be aggressive and come over there, or maybe they're not even deciding to. Maybe they just kind of drift over here, and before you know it, they're there. You need to do one of two things. One is to change your apparent wind this way. And it's interesting. You can be right here in dirt, and you move up just a little bit, and your apparent wind goes forward. You clear out pretty quick, and you're moving this way. So now your masthead flies there. Even though you might think you're in the wind shadow, you get out of there super fast. So you can do it that way. You could do the opposite. You could bear off and maybe even go by the lee in this case, just for temporarily, and then your parent wind's here, and this exact same effect. You're out pretty quick. Or you could just jibe, depending on your boat and all that stuff.
Easy enough.
But
the point is to recognize it as soon as you, just don't wait, but recognize it, and little subtle adjustments can get you out of it quick, and you can carry on your way.
Yeah, I'm always amazed coaching, like people are often looking forward, their eyes, ears, they're looking forward, yeah, sure, there's a mark ahead, but besides the mark, which you can look at once and you kind of know where it is and check in every once in a while, but everything's happening behind you. So I'm always saying to my teams that I'm coaching, I'm like, the play's back, look back more, look back. So you're always, the answer isn't, oh, the sheets just got soft, what's wrong? Look back then. Yeah, you should see this person drifting up, and you're like, as they get a little closer, you should change your angle before, or maybe you want to go that way anyway, and you're like, well, this is our chance to jibe and get out of there. You make it a choice, but you should be looking back anyway to figure out what's going on.
Good point. Okay, so real quick, for the benefit of those without spinnakers, you sail a lot of sunfish. Does any of this change with the single sail just fully out?
Yeah, so it's exactly the same as with a spinnaker without. What you sort of have to look at, like the advanced version of this is any part of your sail in that shadow. So I find with a spinnaker, a asymmetric spinnaker, you're kind of your profile is bigger, right? So your apparent wind has to be missing this boat, and if it's just barely missing it where you are, maybe the boat's here. Let's just say that. And you're like, oh, good, my masthead flies just behind his main. Well, your spinnakers, your apparent wind's here, right? But your spinnaker's behind that main. So I think it just makes you a bigger target. And it's probably a worse bad air scheme, right? There's just a lot of sail up, right? And by the way, this could be your J70 in the wing mode. It's the same thing. Okay, well, speaking of J70s, let's explain the drawing in the reach mode then. That sort of angles up. So a little bit of a spoiler alert. The answer is the same, is you want to keep your apparent wind away from them. So a lot of the reasoning behind this is sometimes hard to get your mind around. Like, how can I be here and not be in dirty air? Well, it's because I've made my apparent wind go forward and I'm sailing in something different. And, and the answer is that because the apparent wind's there, essentially the wind shadow hasn't gotten there yet. That's the answer. And nothing's more apparent than that, than the apparent wind of a symmetric boat downwind. So let's take an extreme example. When I was coaching the US team with the Nacros, they would go 20 knots in 10 knots of breeze. So they're looking, they're not looking back anymore. They're looking forward for their dirty air and puffs and everything. So they might have gone through a shift and a puff upwind. They go downwind, they sail through it again. Like they went out of it and then they go back and catch up to the puff. Kind of mind-blowing, right?
Yeah, it is, definitely.
If you're going faster than the wind, that's what happens. But even if you're not, a J70 is not going to go faster than the wind. Most asymmetric boats, unless you're just ripping on foils or something, you're not playing that game. You're not on an ice boat most of the time. But what you're looking at downwind is this trail again, not unlike, so let's draw the spinnaker again. And it's not unlike upwind. It's got a little bit more of a vacuum. It's probably a little bigger footprint. There's more sail area. But you sort of have that same sort of tail behind you. You sort of see upwind. If you go look at that video from last week, and we looked at the fact that there's actually pretty good flow right here. It separates right here, stays attached a little bit, but that's kind of irrelevant. There's this trail behind you. And once again, you look at your apparent wind. So if your apparent wind is here, you're okay. You know, if you're go a little lower, it's down here, you know, like you change it pretty quickly based on your angle as you speed up and slow down. You know, here, you know, if you're here and your apparent wind is aft a little bit, you're actually okay. Even though you think you're in dirty air here, it hasn't gotten there yet, right? Like you're going just because of your speed and everything. It's kind of a bizarre concept. You know, here you might want to change your apparent wind to go forward. If you bear off here, all of a sudden your apparent wind may go aft, and all of a sudden you are in this dirty air. So once again, you're just looking at where your masthead fly is compared to the boats.
That's certainly counterintuitive, where most would sort of encourage you not to sail higher up into the other boat, but you know, it's so to create a little bit of space, but you're actually making your sub worse.
You're in a tough situation here, because if you go a little higher, you get closer and closer, and you may end up there even without, you know, your apparent wind initially moves forward, right? And maybe you're okay. I'm exaggerating the angles here, but because they're going lower, you're going to converge, and before you know it, your apparent wind will be in at them. And if you go low, you immediately put your apparent wind at them because you've moved it aft. So it's a very tricky spot, and that's why, you know, if we always call it jumping somebody downwind an asymmetric boat. You know, we did this in catamarans all the time, kind of the original asymmetric boats, right? But you know, you ever come around the weather mark, you're reaching down, going really fast, and you know, if you want to get this person, if you jibe at the same time, they're in a tough spot. Unless they match your jibe or do better perfectly and keep their apparent wind in front of you the whole time, either high or low, you know, makes them in trouble. But that's the jumping.
Yeah, no different than the Sail GP guys on the first boundary after the first mark, you know, that first jibe, right? America's Cup.
Right, well, that's exactly what's happening, right? You jump them, the boat behind almost has the advantage at that point. And if they can soak a little bit so that they get a little bit in front of them, you know, so you're bow out a little instead of even, that gets even harder and harder on blue.
Which brings the point
of this. Is you move around your apparent wind to be free, though. And you know, it's very different mechanism with the apparent wind forward as it is aft when you're in that drag mode versus reach mode, but it's really the same effect.
Real quick, I thought one of the most fascinating things of our talk last week about upwind sailing was positions that you know most people would think were really bad. In terms of asymmetric sailing, downwind and wind shadows, where are the good, better, best, worst to sail?
Yeah, so there are you know, there's sort of this part where what are kind of my safe zones downwind? I think there's less, for one thing, right? Like, you know, I think that this, unlike upwind, where I like this spot right here, like upwind, this is one of my favorite spots, right? You know, because you can get out of it easily. You know, even if I creep up a little, I have to just go into foot mode for a second and I'm safe again. And that is, I think downwind, it's a much more dangerous place. You know, the equivalent of that downwind you might think is kind of here. And like we just talked about, whether I go up or down, either way, I'm in trouble, right? So there's really no safe escape. You know, really, you know, this side of it is much better. You know, if you're behind them, you know, if you're ahead, of course, you're behind. But if you're ahead, you know, it's this sort of nose to nose is pretty good in asymmetric. You know, I think as soon as you go back from nose to nose, you're in danger. I don't like that. The other thing is, I think it's, you know, you're moving away downwind. Like, I think downwind, it isn't, you know, I think you can get back a little bit in this trail. And I think my experience is it kind of trails off quicker than upwind. And I think the reason is upwind, you're going upwind, it's, you know, the wind is going downwind, it's bringing it away from you. Whereas downwind is kind of bringing it with you, and you're kind of compressing it all. I think you can get a little closer without damage downwind.
Okay. Without dragging this on any longer, but so if you were to sort of take the high bird's eye view, especially, you know, we just had this 70 boat Melges 15 event where it's really hard to find these little slices of happy space, right? Where in terms of big fleet wind shadows, can you give me some thoughts there when you have these groups, where to avoid with the groups?
Well, I think what happens is really the game, you got to set yourself up right at the windward mark. You know, if you want to go straight, if you want to carry on as opposed to jibe, you know, it's this, everybody's getting in line, you know, and you're trying to keep your line. And if this guy goes way up, you know, you sort of get into this danger of starting to get rolled. Like if they get a puff first and they catch a wave and all of a sudden they're here, you're in trouble, right? So, you know, back to that part, you don't want to be here. And you got to balance that with when you want to jibe, because so what I think happens is if it's a big fleet, you have no choice but either to kind of get in line, and you're probably going to end up going higher than you want to go. Everybody's going higher than they want to go. And the trouble is you can't be like, I'm going to be clever, I'm going to take the low road. You know, there's this picket fence going by you. And if you go really low, then you're not planing and they are. So you might get a little separation, but they're going so much faster.
Right.
So I don't think you have that option to soak low. And then the only other option is if you think that maybe jibing is the correct answer, you know, hopefully there's an offset, you know, there's a windward mark and an offset to a little gap. But, you know, the problem with jibing here is that your angles are so tight that you go immediately to the starboard ley line. You know, there's this picket fence of people going upwind. So kind of early on in the big fleet, I think you just have to go in line with the guy ahead of you. And if you try to go above him, you just force him to go higher, and then you go higher. You know, that doesn't work. So you sort of play nice with the person in front of you, and then you hope the person behind you does the same. And then the game comes of this jumping thing. Like, when do you decide to jibe? So if I'm this orange boat and I'm kind of hanging in there, holding my line, and this, you know, if you look at the zone here, you know, everybody's got this zone here. If you're in line, you're kind of safe. So maybe that answers your question from before. Where's my safe spot? It's in line. If you don't want to get jumped and you decide you want to jibe, what you do is you go a little low and slow to get below this person so that when you jibe, you bow out and you can't jump yet. If you let this person soak on you when you go to jibe, and this is what happens near the ley line, they know you're going to jibe soon. So they're kind of in the driver's seat. If they can go a little fast and low and just kind of get their bow down, they can jump you. Okay,
so we may have to, you know, we could probably talk for hours on this one, but I'll get extended out one. I'm just curious that further down the course, you know, how boats tend to kind of group up, and at some point you got to recenter yourself, and, you know, you sort of switch from this sort of one-on-one boat wind shadow situation. We're trying to work around groups of boats. So if you're further down the course, how do you deal with setting yourself up for, maybe, let's say there's a group of 4 or 5 boats. How giant is this wind shadow, and how do you get around it?
Yeah, so if there's a whole bunch of boats and you're like crossing through, for example, you know, this is a pretty gigantic wind shadow, right? Like, even if there's just 2 of them, now you've doubled. Maybe there's 3. You know, if you're trying to get through here, that's pretty awful, right? Like, even crossing them is tough. So you got to decide whether it's worth crossing and how you do it, right? Because if you head up, it just kind of gets worse. So you got to get through this. And, you know, the answer is, you know, if it's light or something, it may not be possible. You get here, then you just stop. And so a lot of times I'll just decide whether I'm going to, you know, just avoid the clump completely and just jibe with them, kind of, or not. You know, I think you just can't go through that massive wind shadow.
Yeah.
And that's probably different than upwind too, right? You can cross behind a bunch of port tackers or starboard tackers, right? And do all right. You can't do that downwind.
Well, we'll have to, maybe for next time, we'll see if we can get some drone footage from the recent Melges 15 event. It'd be fascinating to see how people interact further down the course and what happens. But
yeah, I think one of the answers is you got to decide whether you're going to go to all the way to ley line or not. And it's pretty hard to call from far out. So one of my favorite things to do is get in line long enough find some big gap. Like I love to be all alone with an asymmetric, you know, jibe when there's a big lane, and then you're all by yourself, and then you can do whatever angle you want. You can just rip. I think if you take it all the way to the corner and you have even one person that can jibe on you, you're just, just in trouble, right?
Yeah, it's a long way back. All right, you mentioned that. So I think the last thing to touch on here would be the wind strength that you mentioned there. So
Yeah,
I guess both with the drag.
Well, it's in either mode, right?
Yep.
It's really the same thing. You're going to meet up with a puff at your apparent wind for the most part. If you point your apparent wind at a puff, you will probably mesh with it. So suppose you're around the weather marks here, and you kind of see a puff over here, and it's pretty small, or maybe it's big. Maybe it's this side has more wind. And that puff is probably moving also. And, puffs, the nature of puffs is different. Sometimes they move quickly, sometimes they don't. But as a really good starting point, if I'm, say, here, and my apparent wind is here, because I'm going straight down in drag mode, if I want to mesh up with this puff, I'm probably not going to mesh up with it. So what I do is I head up a little bit, and that changes your apparent wind. And I know how much to head up to meet up with this puff by my apparent wind pointing at the puff. And then as we get down the course, I'll end up here. And then, it's not a perfect thing because puffs move at different speed, but I'll change my angle to keep lining up with the apparent wind. And as I get closer and closer, before I know it, I'm in the puff. And, a lot of times it's subtle. I might be here. I only have to move the apparent wind just a little bit. I'm pointing at it. And as long as I keep it pointing at it, I'm going to end up, boom, right in the puff. And it actually works with asyms too. So same idea. If you're kind of pointing at a puff because you're going, now you might be semi catching up to it, right? So if your apparent wind is here, you're probably going to mesh up with that puff. If you look at your apparent wind and it's really here, you're like, I may never get there. I shouldn't even bother. It's going to be past me. If maybe I'm here and my apparent wind's here and it's in front of it, maybe I slow down a little bit and move the apparent wind aft so I'm sure that I mesh up to it. It's kind of, some of it's counterintuitive, right?
Right.
You're moving your apparent wind around to go mesh up with something.
Using body weight, right? Not the rudder.
Yeah. Exactly. Use the body weight, not the rudder. Yeah.
Okay, so final question. The size and I guess the breadth and depth of these wind shadows, do they change through light wind to heavy wind? What happens?
Sure. I always thought, even upwind, that it's maybe that the distance of the wind shadow, I'm not sure if the actual distance changes much, but I think the effect changes a lot. So if it's really windy and you're already going hull speed, say, up downwind, and you're not planing, but it's windy enough to go hull speed, but pretty easily, and you get a little wind shadow, you're still probably going to go close to hull speed. But if it's only blowing 6 and you get a wind shadow and you're going 3 and now you're going 2, percentage wise, that's a huge difference. So I definitely pay attention to it. The lighter it is, the more and more I pay attention to it. And the windier it is, the more I don't worry about it as much.
That's also true. The windier it gets, the you're starting to play with the apparent wind game.
Well, I also think the effect is less. You can play with the apparent wind pretty easily in both of them, so you can move it around to stay clear. But if I'm in it, and maybe if I'm right next to somebody, I just find that the losses aren't nearly as big and heavier, and I think it's more because of the speed, the relative speeds, and maybe if it's windy, just windy enough to plane and you're asym, then maybe you really care, because even this tiniest little lull will take you off the plane. Or back in the foiling case, right? It takes you off your foil. Somebody's still going 20 while you're now going 6. Right. Cool. So that matters. Yeah.
Cool. All right. As from the coach's eye, is there any one good drill that you would recommend for people to sort of practice managing downwind wind shadows and stuff like that?
Yeah, I love we have a couple drills we do here a lot, which are I really like. There's always the downwind start because everybody is lined up in this, and you get a good start, you're in dirty air, right? And right away. We have another one we do where the first person to hit the weather mark, somebody blows a whistle and everybody turns around. And now you're all going down to the same leeward mark, but the slower people are in front, and all of a sudden there's this giant log jam going downwind. And you kind of learn pretty quickly, that's a really good chance in both of those cases to move around your apparent wind and see what happens.
Cool. All right. I'm gonna go out and do some here, I think.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing though is I see too many people looking forward too much and not back. I look it up in my masthead fly, I feel it in my face, I know where my apparent wind is, and I'm always positioning it either for wind shadow or for puff. My play is back.
All right, perfect. I feel smarter already. I'm gonna be faster downwind. I know it. Dang it.
Perfect. Well, a lot of times, like displacement one particularly, the boats aren't very different in speed. Keeping in clear air and lining up with the puff is the speed difference. There's only so much the trimmer can do in that condition.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I think, maybe with Asym, there's a little more technique. But there's so little gains downwind in this drag mode that staying in clear air and lining up with the puff is your advantage.